Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. This bill should not pass. We've heard some very good contributions in here detailing the horrors that would occur if it becomes law. I do congratulate my colleague Senator Sarah Hanson-Young for the work that she has done over many years on this issue, bringing the voice of refugee advocates, human rights activists into this chamber, representing the rights of refugees in such a clear, articulate way. I also do draw attention to my colleagues in this place and people who read Hansard or listen to the debate to read the speech of Senator Christine Milne, the leader of the Australian Greens. She just made a very telling speech setting out the crimes that really are embodied in this legislation if it goes through, and particularly nailing the issue that there are embodied in this legislation crimes against humanity. We need to realise how incredibly serious this legislation is that we are dealing with tonight. A large number of legal and human rights experts have warned how dangerous the bill will be if it's passed. They do not support the Migration and Maritime Powers Legislation Amendment resolving the Asylum Legacy Caseload Bill 2014. Just that title, resolving the Asylum Legacy Caseload. This doesn't resolve the caseload. It inflicts cruelty, can result in death, it breaks the law, it should not be passed. Refugees are essentially being used as an electoral football here. We've seen this occur under the Liberal and National parties for years now, where refugees, asylum seekers are demonised, and the issue is played out, particularly coming into elections, where there is such carry-on about the issues of people seeking asylum in this country that people do become fearful. They do start to worry about what's happening with our borders, but it's because of the hysterical, extreme way the people in the government present this issue. Now, I do acknowledge that there have been and are some individual MPs and members of the Liberal and National Party who don't hold the views of the Abbott government. However, we need to acknowledge that when the Liberals and Nationals were in opposition and now in government, they are driving a very ugly policy process here and now pushing forward with laws that will do such deep damage, not just to individuals, but to the very fabric of our country itself. The harshness and cruelty of this law is so extreme. If this bill passes, and I understand a deal has been done, and there will be an absolute shift by the Australian government, and senators who are considering voting for this need to recognise what they will be voting for. They will be voting to trash respect for the law, voting to trash recognition of the rights of refugees. Because essentially what this bill will do, if it's passed, will establish in law the mistreatment of asylum seekers and refugees who leave their country where they have faced death, rape, imprisonment, persecution, torture. It will now be very easy to return those people to those terrible threats. This is how far this government is considering going with this legislation. Now, we know it doesn't have to be like this. Many of us here would remember the 1980s and the 1990s, the issue of refugee rights, the issue of asylum seekers on this country barely occupied any space in our media. And that's really worth reflecting on why that was the case. And why it was the case is because there was a bipartisan approach with Labor and the Coalition at that time actually largely working together for a humane approach to people who have every right to come to this country to seek asylum. And so many refugees were processed quickly and in a way that their safety wasn't in jeopardy and were able to rebuild their lives in Australia. And I did want to share with the Senate tonight some comments by former Prime Minister Mr Fraser made at the 2012 Whitlam Foundation annual speech. And it really does give detail about how this developed, because the period he's describing in the first instance is in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, a war that had been very divisive in Australia, extremely divisive. But despite that, we saw the two major parties at the time, the leaders of those parties, come together with a humane and largely successful approach to handling people who were coming to this country. So these are the words of Mr. Fraser. At the end of the Vietnam War, tens upon tens of thousands of Indo-Chinese sought to flee to safety. Initially, the Whitlam government decision was to have limited numbers of people from Vietnam. My government made the decision to take large numbers of people. Gough Whitlam did not play politics with this. It would have been easy to do. Instead, he led his party to fully accept the convention of the post-war years. Bipartisanship on issues of immigration was maintained. The bipartisanship was fundamentally important. It shows that political conflict can live alongside the sustaining of a shared, deep respect for people regardless of colour, race or religion. A belief that people should be respected for who they are. The capacity to engage in conflict and maintain such a respect depends on a degree of consensus between political leaders. Gough Whitlam and I participated in this consensus. If instead of this consensus, the disgraceful race to the bottom of the populist political point scoring of recent years had prevailed, the cost to Australia would have been enormous. Now, I do say that that is the most significant quote, and I urge senators to read all of Mr. Fraser's speech. And I did want to just share one other aspect, one other comment that he made in that speech, because it brings us forward to recent times. And Mr. Fraser stated, "Before Tampa, there would have been many who accepted that the idea of the White Australia policy was dead, and that those who supported racism had no influence. Since Tampa, despite the great and beneficial diversity of people within Australia today, there are many who interpret our attitude to refugees and the toxic and demeaning debates that have taken place over this question as a resurgence of racism." They were Mr. Fraser's words, resurgence of racism. He went on to say, "Our treatment of refugees and the poisonous debate engaged in by our major political parties has done Australia much harm throughout our region." Now, this is where we are today. The resurgence of racism, harm done within our own region, and it's actually now beyond that. Mr. Fraser's speech was from 2 years ago. We have now got a very bad name around the world because of the way we are treating refugees. It is a shameful period in our history, and if this bill goes through, it will even be much more shameful. The indignity, the abuse, the cruelty of this bill is encompassed in the reintroduction of temporary protection visas. This means that refugees will have to prove and reprove they are refugees. Now just think of our daily lives, our freedom, our rights, the pleasures we take, how we are able to hang out with our families and friends, largely when we wish, when we get out of this place. We can visit our special places. We can work, but for those on temporary protection visas, those basic rights, things that we take for granted, are not there for these people. And let's remember, Australia has tried this before, so we know the cruelty this brings, the anguish, the emotional and mental cost. People not knowing their future, left in limbo, unable to reunite with their family. This is what we are about to impose on people. When the history of our country is written, this period, I think, will shock people when they read back on it. What this country, successive governments, Labor and Coalition, have inflicted on people who have every right under international law to come here. And what will deserve special treatment, and I think will so deeply shock people, is temporary protection visas. This is so ugly. I'm still shocked that I live in a country, obviously with my politics there's a lot that I've disagreed with, but I never thought either side of politics would get to the point where they would treat people like this. So it's understandable people ask what we should do. We should recognise that seeking asylum is a humanitarian issue rather than an issue of border security or defence, and people seeking asylum must be treated with compassion and dignity. I think, again, considering what this bill does, we need to remember that as a signatory to the Refugee Convention, Australia should assess the applications of all asylum seekers who arrive in our territory, including our territorial waters, irrespective of their mode of arrival. And we also need to recognise that Australia has additional responsibilities to refugees from countries where Australian defence personnel have been deployed in conflict situations. Clearly, there is a link there, and it is something that we should recognise. We should work to settle people quickly. This is what we need so people can rebuild their lives, gain work, find a home, study, and do all the things that people do have the right to do. Now, the figures themselves show how unnecessary temporary protection visas are. When we had them before, some 95% of people on TP visa first time round ended up with permanent protection. I mean, that speaks volumes. 95% of those people who were put through such humiliating processes have to live under such a degrading way. 95% were given permanent protection, part of our society now. Now, there's no reason to believe this statistic would be any different now. Now, we particularly need to give consideration when we're debating this bill to the role of the minister. He's quite rightly figured strongly in this debate because the bill gives unacceptable power to the immigration minister, and I think we should be asking why. The minister will be really able to make life and death decisions about individual refugee cases. This means the chance of people being sent back to a situation of grave danger, even death, is a real possibility. Imagine this, the bill denies even babies born on Australian soil, in Australia, here, to parents who have arrived by boat any protection. They will be effectively rendered stateless. Again, there's so many aspects of this bill that it shocks you, and then you're shocked again and again and again. They will be retained offshore. These babies will be retained offshore until they're forced to go to a place like Nauru. The changes to the definition of refugees is one of the most despicable aspects of the bill, and so much flows from this abuse that's set out in the law, in the bill. This change means it will be easier. It will be easier to send more people back to where they have come from, where they could be abused, tortured or killed. We don't offer them assistance, we don't offer them protection. We take actions that will lead to harm. The power the minister will have is so troubling. We have the scenario that if the department asserts the refugee can simply modify their behaviour, that's the word, modify their behaviour to avoid persecution or harm at home, then they'll be sent back. What a flimsy policy. I mean, flimsy is too light a word. What an outrageous, cruel policy. Because the people who are making this assessment, they will be either told what they have to do in making those assessments to approve as few refugees as possible, or they will just know that that's what their job really hinges on, to really send by far the majority of people back. That's the situation we're facing. Then there's the issue of travel documents. Now, it's quite understandable that so many asylum seekers arrive with no papers. That's been the case forever with refugees, asylum seekers. That's the nature of escaping from the abuse that they've come to experience. Now, having no travel documents now can be used against them. It can mean, in fact, that they are knocked back. So let's reflect on history here. Let's remember people fleeing from Nazi Germany, fleeing at the end of the Vietnam War, from Pinochet's Chile. All those parts of our history come to mind. And I do believe that so many of those people would have escaped with no papers. But then, at that time, we did the right thing. We assisted those people, assisted them to settle, to rebuild those lives in Australia, and so many of those people have gone on to have wonderful lives here, be a very rich and important part of our society, all those people. But now we don't do that. We do need to ask how many of the people who will come here now will be treated like we've treated people in the past who had every right to come to our country. I fear under Minister Morrison, under the Abbott government, no matter who the minister is, very few people in this situation, similar to those escaping from Pinochet's Chile, from Vietnam post-1975, from Nazi Germany, will be treated in the same way. You come to the point, how extreme does this government want to be? It already have very tough legislation in place. It's already loaded against refugees, and now it wants to be so much more extreme. The current Migration Act has a very tough process to check if asylum seekers should be given protection. Asylum seekers will now, however, have a minimalist process that will determine issues of life and death. Now, some call it the fast-track process, but it's a fast-track process, back for most of them, back to misery. Because it's essentially about accepting minimal numbers of refugees. Consider the state so many people are in when they arrive here. They're frightened, they're intimidated, particularly often intimidated of authority. And who do they have to deal with when they come here? Military people, and I know that many of those military people are absolutely trying to do their best, but put yourself in the mind of these people who are coming here. So often they've fled authority, fled from military people, and then they've got to again adjust to the situation that confronts them when they first arrive. Then they face department representatives who have been told if they have told what the minister expects from them. Like, that is going to be set out very clearly. And again, I repeat, many of them will know, even if it's not told how many they can approve, that that's what the minister wants. That will be the culture. That will be the intent of how this bill will play out for people who have to put it into effect. Asylum seekers will, in the main, have to quickly assemble their case with no legal assistance. That's the other aspect of this. How hard will that be? You're confronted by a new range of authorities, and you've got to try and articulate your case. You may have no travel papers, and you will have no legal assistance. On top of this abusive process, abusive people, this bill gives the government the power to disregard whether someone is at risk of torture. Can you imagine that? I mean, torture is something that I've often felt in our society, that it's one of those characteristics that one recognises that torture is wrong, that it needs to be, it's a criminal act, and one needs to speak out and highlight what regimes engage in torture and how we need to assist people who escape from that. But here we have a government with the power to disregard whether somebody would be at the risk of torture if they return. I mean, again, it's one of those aspects that I find so hard to believe, that the government wants to make torture effectively irrelevant when it comes to determining the status of asylum seekers. Another horror aspect of this bill is that it is designed to put the government actions above international maritime law. This will allow the minister and future ministers to force people on boats back to the country they have left without any court oversight. Again, a real abusive process and our international obligations under law. I've set out the case, and many of my colleagues have too, in a very thorough way, while this bill should not be passed. I think just to touch on, there is also the very ugly aspect of how so much of this work has been outsourced to a private company, Serco. And that deserves a mention here, because every time the law gets worse in this place, Serco, a private company, makes more profits. And that's now on the record, because this is a British multinational, it's in financial trouble, and significantly the company, which is favoured by governments in other countries as well, and by ours to lock up refugees, has admitted that it's its Australian detention operations that is effectively keeping it afloat. So it's in a financial difficulties, and based on cruelty, we now have private companies that are profiting out of the misery of people who our country, our government, our departments should be working with to help them rebuild their lives. This bill should not pass. It will be a shameful day if it does. Thank you, Acting Deputy President.